Hey friends, welcome to our kitchen. We are going to be baking all of our sourdough bread for the week today, so come along and join us for the ride. Today we're going to be baking an Artisan sourdough loaf. We're going to be baking 2 sandwich loaves that have partly milled flour, and we're going to be baking bagels. This is just going to get us started for the week, and then we're going to do all of our discard recipes another day this week.
So first things first, when I wake up in the morning, I'm going to take out my starter and I'm going to feed it. I'm going to feed it with 1 cup of flour, all-purpose, and a half a cup of water. I just use tap water. You can honestly use any water you drink. You'll often hear people say not to use city tap water. I use city tap water. I've used it in 2 different places, and my starter has thrived with the city tap water. So it's really what you're comfortable drinking. After I get it all mixed up, I'm going to cover it with my lightweight towel. You can also put a lid lightly on as long as it's not sealed. I prefer to do a towel, and then I set my jar lid kind of crooked. You can see here that I've got a gap so it's not sealed. Then I'm just going to place my starter into the warmest part of my kitchen. Mine is right up here by my stove because it creates warmth and moisture as I'm using my stove. Here's where my starter is now, and we're going to look for it to double in size before it's ready to use. Once it's ready to use, we're going to go ahead and mix up our dough. So I'm going to start with putting water in all 3 of my bowls. I kind of have a system, so I use certain bowls for certain breads so that I don't get mixed up which one is which. But I'm just going to first fill up every bowl with the water that it needs. If you haven't grabbed my free recipe bundle yet, it comes with my sandwich bread and my artisan bread, as well as my discard banana bread. You can grab that in the description below. And then if you get my full recipe ebook, it also has my bagel recipe in there. You can get both of these in the description below of this video. Once I get all my water added, we're going to go ahead and put starter in each one of our bowls. So my artisan bread requires a full cup of sourdough starter. I just scoop it out, plop it in the water. And then my bagels require a cup of starter also, so we're going to scoop out our cup, put it in our bagel bowl. Next, we're going to do our sandwich loaf. Each loaf requires half a cup of starter, and I'm doing 2 loaves, so we're going to do a full cup of starter in that bowl. Then I'll add salt to each bowl. You can use any salt that you like. I actually use pink Himalayan sea salt, although I have it in this handy container that is just a regular sea salt container, so don't be confused by the pink salt coming out of the blue container. So fun fact, sandwich breads usually have sugar added to them. I like to use honey in my homemade loaves just because it's a little bit healthier and it tastes super delicious. Then we're just gonna go ahead and get all these mixed up. I usually start in my regular loaves and then I move my way to the one with honey just so I'm not getting honey in my other loaves, but really it's not that much, so it wouldn't make a huge difference. You can see here whisking the bread together that it's not going to be completely combined. There's going to be like some chunks of starter, but that's totally fine. Next, I'm going to add all the flour to my bowls. I'm doing mostly all-purpose with these. And our sandwich bread, we're actually going to add in half the amount of flour is going to be fresh milled flour. Fresh milled flour has tons of health benefits, but it also can keep your bread from rising super well because it's really heavy. And so I like to do half all-purpose and half fresh milled flour. So this is my grain mill that I mill my own flour. If you guys have been considering milling your own flour, I highly recommend this Harvest Nutrimill. You can actually get a discount code in the description below. This mill honestly makes milling your own flour so simple and easy, and something you can even do with a kid on your hip. Another thing I love about this mill is that it's super quick. So you literally just pour in the wheat berries and you get like instant flour. You can see here Thea's gonna help me get my fresh milled flour put into the sandwich loaves. Notice she touches the flour because she just wants to feel the difference on how soft it is. Now we bring in the 2-year-old and things get a little bit busier, but I'm going to put her to work and she's going to mix up our artisan loaf for us. while I go ahead and feed the remainder of my starter. Thea's gonna go ahead and get this starter mixed up for us. Basically, whatever is left after I use what I need out of my starter jar, I just feed it again with a cup of all-purpose flour and a half a cup of water in my half-gallon size jar. So while they're mixing up those, I'm gonna go ahead and get mixing up one of the other breads. I typically like to use my Danish dough whisk for mixing up this dough, but because she's using it, I'm just gonna go ahead and use my hand. After we get these all mixed up, I'm going to just cover these with a damp towel. The damp towel is simply going to keep the dough from drying out. All right, so you notice there that I wet my hands, and I'm going to start my first set of stretch and folds. The first set of stretch and folds, the dough is going to be pretty sticky and it's not going to feel super dough-like, but that's okay. The more stretch and folds that you do, the dough will actually become easier to work with. This one is my bagel dough. This is really, really thick, so it might seem a little challenging to do stretch and folds. Just do the best you can and use a second hand if you need to help get it pulled over. All right, now we're going to move on to the sandwich loaf. So this one actually has a little bit harder time sticking together because I have that fresh milled whole wheat flour in there, and it just has a different texture and consistency. But that's okay. It, again, will work, and it'll keep working its way into a more workable dough. So once I get this first set of stretch and folds complete, I'm going to go ahead and cover this up. We're going to come back in 30 minutes and do our second set of stretch and folds. Okay, so the second set of stretch and folds, again, we're going to wet our hand to keep the dough from sticking to it. Now I want to talk a minute about stretch and folds and how you should really make sure you're getting these done on all 4 sides and that you're really pulling that dough over. This is going to help incorporate your dough, get that good gluten development so that your bread can be nice and like just have a good texture. When I first started out doing sourdough, I wasn't doing these very well. I was kind of like afraid to touch the dough, that I was going to ruin it. And then my bread tended to be more dense. And once I figured out to do these stretch and folds really well and having that 30-minute break in between, the texture of my bread just got so much better and just like lighter and crispier on the outside. So do these sets of stretch and folds really well and be sure to have that 30-minute gap in the middle of them. We're just going to speed this video up a little bit so you don't have to sit and watch me do all the sets of stretch and folds in real time. All right, so we're going to move on and we're going to do stretch and fold sets number 3 and number 4, and then we'll move on to the next step. All right, so real quick, this is our 4th set of stretch and folds, and I just want you to see this first loaf, how the consistency's really changed. It's gotten a lot more stretchy, and it's not sticking to my hands as much, so you'll see the change in your dough throughout each set of stretch and folds. Now I'm going to be putting my dough in the fridge overnight for a long ferment, so I'm going to simply cover this with plastic wrap. This is so that your dough doesn't dry out while it's in the fridge. So I'm going to cover each bowl in plastic wrap, and then we're going to throw this in the fridge and come back in the morning. So here we are in the morning. We're going to be prepping our banneton basket and greasing our sandwich loaf pans. I just use a little bit of avocado oil, and then I move it around with a paper towel so that our bread can come out easily. After this, we're going to flour our surface and we're going to get to shaping our bread. So the first one we're going to do is our artisan loaf. Once I get my surface floured, we're just going to spread that around a little bit, and we're going to take our dough out of our bowl. You can see that there's like some air bubbles, air pockets. This dough is a little bit on the colder side, so it's not going to be maybe as stretchy as some that you would see on the internet, but I don't mind working with it when it's cold. It doesn't really make a difference for how your bread turns out. So we're going to flatten that out, fold these 2 sides over, and then we're just going to roll it up. Now, to shape this, the goal is to get the surface tension nice and tight. So to do this, we're going to turn the bread and kind of tuck those bottom edges underneath in order to create that surface tension. I kind of start out doing it around like that, and then I move to this little technique where you're going to push it up, over, in back and tucking those edges under while you're doing it. This can take a little bit of practice to get used to, but I promise you if you do it a few times, you can figure it out. Then we're going to just put a little bit of flour on the surface here and flour in our banneton just so that it doesn't stick to it. And then I like to use my bench scraper to help pick it up and flip it upside down into the bowl. If the bottom isn't quite together, you can kind of pinch your dough together. Next, we're going to do our sandwich loaves. So I'm doing 2 sandwich loaves. So I'm just going to get my plastic wrap off. We're going to put this dough out on the counter. I've got my little helper here. She's always up with me doing my bread. So she likes to usually play with the flour or play with the dough while I'm getting my bread loaves shaped. All right, so we're going to pull out this. Now remember, this is the freshly milled flour, so it's got a little bit different texture. It's got a little bit different color to it, but really everything is the same with this fresh milled flour. So I'm going to use my handy bench scraper. I'm going to cut this in half, and then we're going to get to shaping. Now, shaping your sandwich bread loaf is going to be very similar to shaping the artisan loaf. But at the end, you'll notice that after I build that tension on the top, I just kind of work it into a rectangle shape. This dough is quite a bit stickier with that fresh milled flour, so I'm just going to keep my hands nice and floured. So we're just going to, build that tension in the same kind of motion that we were doing with the artisan loaf. And then once we build that tension, we're just going to kind of tuck the sides under, but getting it into an oval shape. You can kind of see how that works right here. And then for this one, we're going to still use our bench scraper to scoop it up, but we're going to leave it seam side down because the dish that we're putting this in right now is what it's going to bake in. So you want that, seam side to be down. And then lastly, we're going to shape our bagel. So we're going to get some flour, more flour down on the table. And then this bagel dough is quite a bit thicker than the other ones. And I'm just going to use my bench scraper and we're going to cut this into even pieces. I think there's about 8 of them. And we're just going to do kind of like eyeball it for what size bagels you want. So we're going to cut it kind of like into little triangles. And then once we get these ones cut, I'm just going to kind of fold these over to get them into a ball shape. And it's kind of just like a little mini version of building that tension. And then once we get done forming this into a ball, I'm just going to poke a hole in the middle, and then we're going to stretch it out until there's a nice size hole in the middle. These will puff up, so depending on how big of a hole in the middle you want will depend on how much you stretch it into a circle with what size hole in the middle. So we're going to do this with all of them and get them on the baking sheet. After we get them all on the baking sheet, we're going to cover them with a lightweight towel and let them rise until they're noticeably nice and puffy. Then we're going to fill a pot of water and get it boiling. And we're going to add in some baking soda. And once that comes to a boil, we're going to put the bagels in a few at a time and boil them for about 1 to 2 minutes on each side. This is going to help them get that kind of signature bagel shiny outer coating that everyone knows as bagels. Here's what they look like when they're boiling. Then we're just going to take each one out and get them back on the cookie sheet. Now in this video, I actually don't use parchment paper, but I learned the hard way to use parchment paper on your bagels. They were very, very hard to get off of this cookie sheet, and so parchment paper makes them much easier to get off the cookie sheet. So definitely recommend using parchment paper. Once you take them out of the water and they're still wet, that is when you want to add any toppings. We're going to be adding this everything but the bagel seasoning. I also love adding cheese and jalapenos, cheese and pepperoni, whatever you prefer. Now we're going to get out the rest of them, which will just be plain because I've got kiddos that like just plain bagels with no toppings. And now we're just going to pop these in the oven and get them baking, and then we're going to have some beautiful looking bagels. Next up, we're going to get our sandwich loaves baked. How beautiful are these fresh milled sandwich loaves? So delicious. And then last up is our artisan loaf. So this one I'm going to have to flip out onto parchment paper, and then we're going to get it scored and in our Dutch oven. So while I'm doing this, or before I even started this, I had the Dutch oven preheating in the oven at 500 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm going to add some sesame seeds to this one. I've actually never done this before, and I think the result is we actually like it better without the sesame seeds, but it was a fun experiment. Then we're going to go ahead and sift our flour on top of it. This is going to help the scoring blade to go through, and it also makes it look very pretty. All right, so we're going to score this bread. We're going to do one deep cut at a 45-degree angle to get a nice ear on it, and then we're going to do a smaller cuts for the design. Putting the artisan loaf into the oven, it's really important to keep your Dutch oven super hot. So I literally take off the lid for just long enough to get my bread in. I have it all ready to just get into the Dutch oven, and then we're going to quickly put the lid back on and get this thing back in the oven. Keeping it nice and hot is going to help with that rise that you get with your bread. And then you guys, this loaf is so beautiful and so delicious. Thank you for baking our weekly bread with us.